All right, let's get into this real quick. I do have a bit of a sore throat, so I want to make some very clear things up front about this particular video. At the end of the day, the bottom line is you all want to know when you are likely to get your Social Security / tariff / welfare / thing check, right? That's what it is. It's a stimulus to most people for $2,000 that Trump is basically promoting. And he's saying, hey, those people who are on Social Security benefits, they need it. Hey, those people on welfare benefits, they need it. Hey, those people who are working class, they need it. And so at the end of the day, there's a lot of confusion as to who's going to actually get it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, who fits into that category of like the victim class or the fragile class that will be able to get it, even though they're not currently working, not currently paying taxes. Because remember, a lot of the stuff that Trump wants to do when it comes to stimulus funds is about paying it to the working class. So just to be very clear, that is a main focal point with this situation. Now, you guys want to know when is the $2,000 check coming? But as you know, the Supreme Court is deciding whether or not Trump has the capacity to go ahead and essentially tax all these other countries in order for them to bring their products into this country, the tariff. So just to give you, actually, let me do that. I'm going to give you the bare bones definition because I think we should start there. I wanted to start somewhere a little bit higher up, but let's just start with what is the definition of a tariff? Let's just start with that one because I feel like that's going to be a better place than where I was going to go with this. A tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imported or exported goods serving to raise revenue or to protect domestic industries by making foreign products more expensive. So put another way, it's used in two main ways. Number one, to basically drum up income to the government directly, right? Which isn't really helpful for the American people in the immediate sense, but down the line, it could be used to benefit the American people, like a $2,000 tariff stimulus. Then the other thing is to control the economics of the worth of products, services, and the value of the dollar. So in other words, if you put tariffs on things, it makes other countries' goods, which were made very, very quickly, and the cost of labor was very cheap, so they could make the same item, the same raw materials for way cheaper. And if America tried to make that item, there's no way we could do it. We have to pay people, $15 an hour up versus the, $2 an hour that it can be done in another country. So obviously shipping that product over here, it's still massively cheaper. So it's used as a defense mechanism to one highly established economy that has to pay people more against another economy that is not as established that doesn't have to pay the people who make it as much. Now, with that said, I need you to understand something super critical before we go into the analysis of each and every Supreme Court justice and where they stand on the topic of whether or not you should be allowed to have a $2,000 stimulus. Because the simple logic, and it's really simple, if Trump gets to continue to have full power over taxing through tariffs other countries' products however he sees fit, then he's going to make a lot of money and he's going to give everybody a tax break or a stimulus boost or a whatever. You know what I mean? The $2,000 somehow to you. So the idea is with this whole, and I remember some people are going to be like, well, I'm on SSI. That's just going to mess up my SSI. I'm not saying SSI recipients are going to get this. Remember, it's probably going to be for people who are paying taxes. SSI people traditionally aren't paying taxes unless they're on, like a ticket to work program or something like that. So keep in mind, if it were to be paid to SSI recipients, then they would make an exception to the rule of the $2,000 resource limit where you'd be able to receive those funds, just like what they did with the COVID stimulus. Now, to be fair at this situation, these justices are looking at this from a legal standpoint. They're not looking at it from so much the standpoint of should you get $2,000 for surviving Bidenomics, which is it's just what it comes down to, okay? They're looking at it from do these legal doctrines amount to a defense that president or any president can tax other nations how they see fit using tariffs, how they want them to be used. Now, remember, this is not really a Republican-Democrat-oriented argument. Democrats have used tariffs. Republicans have used tariffs. Across the board, they all have. However, Trump is special because the moment Trump does anything, a lot of people on the Democrat side sue him and sue him and sue him and get the states involved, the counties involved. people involved, legislators involved, they sue the shit out. They just go after him nonstop. And some of you will disagree. I don't know how you could. I mean, it is a literal mathematical, it doesn't matter. So the point is, when Trump does something, we get to see the limits of presidential power a lot. You know, with Biden, we saw a little bit of like student loan testing, a little this, a little that. You know, a lot of promises Biden made. I'm not trying to like, kick him, but a lot of promises that he made when trying to become president were de facto impossible to actually come to fruition because legally they had no shot. Now, I want to go through why tariffs are important. And I want you to understand that a lot of the legal arguments as to whether or not Trump has the ability to handle tariffs is on the idea of it being an urgency situation, it being an emergency situation, which is ironic because Trump was just caught arguing that food stamps shouldn't use contingency funds because the government shutdown was not an emergency situation, right? And he ultimately won the situation of, getting the government to open back up, but he did not win the argument of whether or not he has to use the contingency funds. He has to, although of course now they are wiped out. So January 30th, people, there will be a new boost going into the contingency fund for food stamps, but just as a heads up, it will not be enough to cover them all. So as a result of this situation, what you have to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, Trump is claiming that everything is an emergency situation. Now, he's back based off of inheriting an economy that was destroyed, which it was. It's, you can be a super hardcore Democrat and at least have the background, at least have the cognitive resonance to understand that the economy was destroyed. It was getting very, very bad. Yes, the COLA got better towards the end, but the things that were done directly during and after COVID, a lot of it was very, very wrong. Rejoining a lot of the international agreements that we rejoined, very, very wrong choices. And so at the end of the day, we now look at the economy and say, okay, food prices, way too extreme. Housing prices, way too extreme. Insurance prices, they are criminal at this point. A lot of house insurances are now going past the cost of the monthly mortgage. Imagine that. The insurance companies were allowed to push it to the point where now the insurance on the house that you have to have because you have a mortgage is more than the mortgage that you pay for the house. So we're not in a great spot. And, again, it's if you're a Democrat or a Republican, it's not hard to see that everything at the grocery store is very expensive. So if you're in the chat going, how dare you, Trump? I don't care. Whatever. Fine. Do your thing. But at the same time, I do beg upon you, I do ask you to please remember that this video is for the retired, it's for the disabled, it's for the fragile class. And when it comes to politics, the fragile class gets more heavily affected by stupid choices. So if you make stupid financial choices, you are effing over people who don't have space in their life to be effed over. I just want to make that clear because I think there's a little bit of confusion on that particular thing. Like if you talk about, well, there's that guy who owns 30 rental homes and blah, blah, blah. And that person, yeah, he loves Trump and da, da, da. Yeah, he's got a little room. She's got a little room. Sure. But a retired person who can't afford the home that they paid off their entire life to live in now because the economy is total shit, it is not acceptable to put additional burdens on them because of your political beliefs. It's not. And you have to remember, when you look at this situation, if you're making a choice of cost, that's ultimately going to charge retired people, charge disabled people more to exist. Remember, it's not just a single layer. It's not like, oh, they don't have to pay more taxes. No. Honey Boo Boo. No. My little chocolate Snickers. No. My caramel doesn't get it. It's about, is their cost of existence on this planet on a daily basis higher, thereby reducing their level of living? And if you do that to them, then you are a piece of shit by definition. It is what it is. You know what I mean? It just is what it is. So one thing I think everybody just needs to have a basic understanding on, just to be clear, is that there's this thing called a reserve currency. Okay. So what is a reserve currency? Okay. The US dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. This means central banks, governments, and institutions around the globe, the whole earth, hold large amounts of the United States dollars as part of a foreign exchange process, a foreign exchange reserve. And what they do with that money, these countries that hold lots of US dollars, is they facilitate international trade and payments, stabilize their own currencies, intervene in forex markets, and serve as safe haven assets during crises. They also pay off loans using the US dollars. Some of you might think it's weird, but Germany, Mexico, all these places have US dollars, including Russia. Well, they did, that they would spend to pay off loans that they took against banks. Countries take out loans, just like big businesses. Countries are big businesses, but with the power to have a military and, of course, do unspeakable things. As a result, the US dollar, the USD, the reserve currency, it's 58 to 59% of the global allocated foreign exchange reserves, which is way ahead of the euro at 20%, and the yen is only at 6%. Now, what does China want to do? China wants to have their currency as the main used currency. Why? The more countries that have big stockpiles of your currency, that are using your buckaroos, that have some big bank account, or it could just be a computer, that have some big bank account with lots and lots of US dollars in it, it means that the US dollar then is more powerful because there are more people putting faith in it, which means that when you at home in the United States get a dollar, the likelihood of it collapsing, the likelihood of it having a very, very large decrease in value, although you put Biden in there, you get a bit of that, you end up, right, with a mostly stable dollar, the more it is traded and used by other countries as the definitive stabilized currency. Why is this important? The reason you have gas prices that are so cheap, food that is still as cheap as it is, the reason we as a country don't make that many products, we have services, but we don't make that many products, and we still have a currency that's worth anything, is because of the reserve currency. It's because other nations who do make stuff, who do sell us stuff, they use our currency as a de facto way of paying for things. The more bucks that are out there being used, the more stable it is for us to have an economy in America. Now, if our reserve currency, our dollars, become highly stable or highly unstable, meaning Europe creates its own, which, as you can see with the whole Palestine, what's happening with Great Britain, what's happening with Israel, we're about to have allied forces to some degree fall apart. We're about to have literally the old school Russia and China on this side and America and Britain on this side. Those are about to die off. We're about to have a new, as you would put it, world order of different massive entities doing different types of things. Okay, when it comes to these groups who used to hate each other are now going to be part of their own little group, and these groups that used to hate each other are now part of their own little group. So what's happening is this. We are facing the reduction of our use of the US dollar in international markets. We used to have a lot of money out there that was used by most countries. We now are going to be approaching the 50% mark and dropping faster and faster. Why is this happening? It's happening for a lot of reasons. A, the United States was piss poor managed by a bunch of idiots known as politicians you guys voted for. I'm not blaming you. It's everybody did it. They all voted for idiots. Like, if you go look at a lot of the people that are voted in, they're usually people who created failed companies or never did anything with their life. Like, if you look, a classic example, AOC, Mamdani. These people have never built a single thing in their life. And yet they are like, and there's ones on the Republican side too. There's absolutely ones on the Republican side too. But the point is, we keep voting in beautiful faces with empty brains. That's what we seem to be doing. So as a result of this, what happens is that these other countries are becoming stabilized. Their currency is stabilized, and they're using more and more of their currency to dictate how they spend money and take out loans. So as Earth tends to rotate, it creates more evolved countries, which then rely less on America for goods to be purchased and sold. So no matter what, we as Americans have a problem because we can't really outgrow our debt. And our debt is massively growing out of control. Even if Trump is doing an amazing job, we're still growing it. We're still adding massive amounts of debt. There was a time where everybody said, look, if there was more than 25 trillion in debt, that the whole thing would collapse. There was a time when everybody said if there was 30 trillion in debt, everything would collapse. There was a time where we all said if we hit 35 in debt, the whole thing will collapse. There was a time where if we hit $40 trillion worth of debt, the whole thing will collapse. We're at 38 right now. Next year we'll be at 39, almost 40. We are, as a country, in a state of financial emergency. We cannot afford our own citizens and the things that they need. We are the shittiest country financially on planet Earth. We are. But you don't notice it because the debt is largely held by the people. It's not China. It's not India. It's not Japan. It's not, ironically, one of the ones, Luxembourg and Ireland. They hold a lot of our debt. It's not those places that are the problem. The problem is our politicians borrowed money against our people. And now we're in this spot where they've essentially poison pilled our currency to the point where everything's getting really expensive because CEOs are greedy and politicians are idiots. Because they're not going to get voted in again if they do the right thing. And the right thing is to shut it off. All the extra benefits, all the extra welfare, this and that, all the extra this and that. They're never going to get reelected if they shut it off. But if we don't slow it massively with what our handouts, I'm not talking about SSDI, retirement, you paid for that. If we don't slow the handouts, if we don't slow the handouts to some heavy degree, close the gate mostly, then the country will have a collapse when it comes to its reserve currency. Now that you understand that, we can now talk about the reality of essentially where the United States is at. Now, the United States, and I got a little bit in trouble for this when I was searching online. So I asked artificial intelligence to create me a map of the world, every single United States base, military base on it. And I tried multiple different AI groups. Every single one of them basically reported me back to Google. And I can understand why. And the ironic thing is when I had it make me a list of all known, I know that there's some of them in some places that weren't even on the list. So at the end of the day, I wanted to hold up a list for you of every single military base that the United States has across the world. And what you will find is that that map lights up a lot of places. Just so you know, there was the Bretton Woods system, post-World War II, 1944 to 1971. 44 allied nations agreed to put their currencies to the USD. The USD was converted to gold at 35 cents per ounce. The US held 70% of the world gold reserves post-war. This made the USD, our US dollar, the anchor of the global monetary system. After that point, we get to the Nixon shock era of 1971. The US then ended the gold convertibility due to inflation, Vietnam War costs, and trade deficits. We then transitioned to a fiat system, which is USD backed by trust in US economy, not gold. Widely considered the most shitty idea that could have been done, but America did it. Then we get to the petrodollar system of the 1970s. The US-Saudi Arabia deal, OPEC prices oil in USD. Saudi invests surplus in US treasuries. That's where we have international trade and international agreements with these foreign countries in the Middle East. It forces oil importing nations to hold USD for structural demand purposes, which means we make the Middle East hold our dollars and take a lot of our currency and use a lot of our currency, which helps bolster our economy here. Now, here's the deal. A lot of nations still use the US dollar because it's deep. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of liquid markets for it. There's a rule of law and institution behind it because if you don't follow the US law and the US banks and the international banks, there's a US military that's going to ask you to begin following it. There's a lot of network effects. There's a safe haven status, a military and geopolitical power. All right. So this geopolitical power, the Air Force, the Navy, the Uber of the Army, okay? What do you need to know about them? There's a lot of US bases, military bases throughout the world. You take the Earth, you split it like this, and across the Earth, across not just the land, but also the water, there are a lot of US military bases. There's over 200 plus in Europe, over 150 plus in the Indo-Pacific, over 50 plus in the Middle East, over 20 plus in Africa, over 30 plus in the Americas, and then 10 plus in other Oceania-based areas, islands, big islands, okay? Australia, Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia area, stuff like that. What do you need to know? These bases have a lot of military personnel. Fort Bragg, or I guess it's Fort Liberty now, 5,700 people. Fort Cavazos, formerly Hood, 42,000. Joint Base San Antonio, 38,000. These are U.S. bases with a lot of people that are then working with U.S. bases that are out of the country. What do you need to know? The reason we are in an urgency situation is that the only reason you can afford the food that you do right now as it is, even though it's expensive, is because other countries fear our military, because our military has the capacity to end whatever government is in place in almost every single country on earth. It's questionable about China, but otherwise, every other country, America has the capacity to end the government as it exists, which means that those governments fear our military, which means that they have to play along with what the USA wants to do. Now, some people will say that it's terrible, it's horrible, and how could the US do that? All these other countries have the moral high ground. One thing you have to understand about the political spectrum is that you have people on the right that are accustomed to hunting and being a supreme being on earth to the other living beings. And then, of course, these individuals are also caretaking for those other beings, right? You get a lot of that. Then you also have on this side, the woke. They have cute little YouTube farms, and they don't really, to be fair, have a firm grasp on what it is like to have another nation dictate to you what's going to happen. So at the end of the day, just to be very clear, you have two very different mental states. You have the people who build society, which are those, roughneck Republicans that are out in the boonies, creating, prepping the land, using tractors. They're Aggies, they're farmers, they're ranchers. They're basically clearing trees. They're making more of the land for humans. And then, of course, you have the people on the left saying, you've just taken all the trees down, the oxygen conversion capabilities. What have you done? You've killed all the plants and animals there. How dare you? You should set up a solar farm, which will, of course, destroy all the animals and plants and wildlife and anything on that ground, even worse than planting crops. But again, you have that mentality as well. These people don't usually build shit. These people create the foundation for creating societies. And then these people, the middle people, they're the ones who actually set it up to become future potential cities. These people live in the cities, right? The left. These people live in the boonies. These are not suburbanites. The suburbanites are the ones who build cities. All right. So at the end of the day, what does all this mean? It means that if we lose our military supremacy over all other countries on planet Earth, it means that your food will not be affordable. It means that your cars and your housing and your everything and your utilities will not be affordable because the dollar will devalue and the products, raw material, used to create the things that you buy will no longer be financially capable of being shipped to the United States and still be worth purchasing to make into items. So what will happen? Well, everybody will be trying to buy a Toyota and then keep it up for the next 40 years because they won't be able to get other cars here, kind of like how Cuba is. So what do you need to know? The Supreme Court is trying to figure out whether or not Trump is in an urgency, immediate, scary situation where he has to be given the power to tariff, to tax other nations. So the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5th, 2025 in a consolidated case. It was case number 24-1287. It was challenging the president's, Trump's, authority to impose broad tariffs on imports from major trading partners, primarily under, and this is the important one, I want you to remember this one, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Again, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA of 1977, 50 U.S.C. Section 1702. The lower courts had ruled that the IEEPA's grant of power to the president to regulate imports during a declared national emergency, is it an emergency? Is it an urgent situation? Does not extend, this is what the Democrats are claiming, does not extend to imposing revenue-raising tariffs, as the statute lacks explicit language for such actions and is intended for sanctions rather than trade policy. Now remember, Biden used tariffs. He just didn't use them aggressively. He just basically left in what Trump did to begin with. Obama used tariffs. The Bushes used tariffs. The Clintons used tariffs. But nobody gave a shit to say anything until Trump used tariffs. The case raises fundamental questions about executive power, Trump's power, the White House's power in trade. Because, constitutionally, usually, if you want to do something in the country, it's an executive order and the president is very limited. But executive agreements with other nations, the president, the White House, they've got a lot of leeway. They can do a lot of things without congressional approval. All right, so the case raises fundamental questions about the executive power, Trump's power in trade, with justices expressing skepticism towards expansive interpretations that could upend congressional authority over tariffs under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So just to bring it all home again, you want your tariff stimulus. The Democrats have filed suit saying that Trump should not have the power to regulate how much taxes other nations go ahead and get charged. They believe Congress should be in charge of that. If Congress could actually get together and figure out a vote on it, cool. But we can't. Our current system is shit. They can't pass bills fast enough to fix this country. That's the reality. And so you have people that like companies that have like a 10-person board that decides stuff. And then other people like companies that have one leader, and that one leader has to go ahead and get everybody else rolling in the same direction to fix something. The 10-people boards, those are great companies when things are going steady and things are okay and you can take time and think through things. You never use a 10-person board when a country is 38 trillion in debt. You never do that, ever. You have one leader who figures out a direction and goes in that direction. Right or wrong, you have one leader because decisions have to be made every 10 minutes to fix this. And a lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people have never been in an executive position. A lot of people have never owned a company. So it's frustrating because you have an entire American population mostly held by people that have no understanding of how leadership works. They don't. And so it's just weird because you get people who are like, let's slow it down. If you slow this fix down, you ruin it. I mean, the advantage America had post-World War II, you ruin it. All right, so bottom line is this. The major legal doctrines that we're going to go through are essentially what the Supreme Court justices are looking at. And then we're going to go through what each Supreme Court justice is a little bit skeptical about when it comes to Trump's power with this situation. Number one, there's the major questions doctrine, okay, the MQD. This doctrine was recently used again, reinforced in West Virginia versus the EPA in 2022, holds that Congress does not implicitly delegate decisions of vast economic and political significance to the executive branch without clear and specific statutory authorization. So what this whole thing is, the big question doctrine, right? The major question doctrine. The whole point of this is they're saying, did Congress give the president, did Congress in writing say that the president should have the power to go ahead and tax via tariffs all these countries in a high stakes game of chicken to make them give us a better deal? Applied here, it questions whether the IEEPA's vague term regulate can justify tariffs affecting trillions in global trade without explicit congressional intent, potentially rendering the president's actions unlawful absent unambiguous language. So if the Supreme Court rules that the tariffs that Trump has been doing are unlawful, Trump will then have to give back billions upon billions, and depending on how long it goes, trillions and trillions of dollars to other nations. No 2000 stimulus. That's where it's important to the American people. Next legal doctrine, non-delegation doctrine. Rooted in Article 1's vesting of legislative power in Congress, the doctrine prohibits delegating core lawmaking authority, like tariff setting, to the executive branch, to President Trump, without an intelligible principle to guide discretion. In other words, Congress didn't put in place direction, bumpers, right? You go bowling, you have bumpers on the different rails, right? Bumper bowling, right? The Congress didn't put in the bumpers on how the executive branch is supposed to go forward, what the overall intent of how it should be handled going forward should be like. When somebody like passes away and they leave a will and they're like, I want the money to be used for this or this or this. Congress didn't leave enough of that around for the executive branch to be doing what it's doing, or so they claim. Critics argue the IEEPA provides no such limits for tariffs, effectively transferring Congress's exclusive taxing power, which could violate separation of powers if upheld. Congress is supposed to be in charge of taxing people, things, places, countries, etc. But it does seem like Trump is taxing countries a heck of a lot without Congress. The third legal doctrine of interest here is Noscitur Aesosis. Okay. Let me read to you what it is, but then let me give you a practical application of what it actually is. It is a statutory interpretation rule. So, basically it's based on rulings that, came from original statutes, meaning a word is known by the company it keeps. A word is known by the company it keeps. In the IEEPA, regulate appears alongside verbs like investigate, block, and nullify transfers, actions focused on non-economic sanctions, not revenue generation. This suggests regulate is limited to similar regulatory or prohibitive measures, excluding tariffs. All right, let me give you a more make it make sense version of that. Noscitur Aesosis. It's a legal, Latin wording, okay? It's fancy. Associated words canon. It means that a word is known by the company it keeps. Another way of saying that is that if you and I had like an inside joke, like if I looked at you and I was like, but pineapple banana, you know what I mean? Pineapple banana, and then you're like, yeah, oh, pineapple banana, and then there were four other friends who were there that night, and they were like, yeah, pineapple banana. That is a really shitty. I'm starting to understand why they'll never let me be a judge, but that is a really shitty example of what Noscitur Aesosis actually is. It is where there's a group of people that when they look at something, they all know what it means based off of the things that happened in that document, in that situation. It is the pineapple banana doctrine. You're never going to forget that, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for that. I really am. Next one, Jusdem generis, another canon of construction. This limits a general or ambiguous term like regulate to matters of the same kind as the specific examples preceding it in the statute. Okay, I'll read it to you and then I'll give you an example of it. Here it confines the IEEPA's scope to emergency sanctions akin to blocking assets or prohibiting transactions, not imposing duties, as other trade laws explicitly authorize tariffs with precise language. So what they're saying here is, hey, wait a minute. How specific was the terminology used? Was it ambiguous? Yeah, it's pretty ambiguous. There's other laws that were created that are more specific. What do we use? Do we use the more specific rules and regulations, or do we use the more ambiguous? What does regulate really mean? Did they define it? Did they go into detail with the definition of it? Did the document have a separate section with definitions, and did those definitions really go into detail about tariffs? Okay, it is a canon of construction, Latin phrase that limits a general or ambiguous term to matters of the same kind as the specific examples preceding it in the statute. So in other words, if you look at what the statute's about, you're like, oh, okay, this statute's really about A, but Trump might be using the statute for the purposes of B. Well, does that make sense? No, because the statute's really about A, because the stuff preceding that was all about A stuff. Pineapple banana stuff. All right, next one. The whole code. That's going to be the whole code rule. Okay, so what is the whole code rule? Again, it's another Latin phrase. And remember, we're talking about Supreme Court level stuff. So like if you're like sitting there, you're like, I kind of get it, I don't get it. It's Supreme Court level stuff. You know what I mean? All right, this presumes that Congress drafts statutes consistently across the U.S. Code, avoiding interpretations that render terms redundant or inconsistent with related provisions. So in other words, when Congress uses a word and they legally define it a certain way, they're supposed to consistently legally define it the same way. Do they do that? No. Especially the stuff from the House of Representatives. That shit is all over the place. Remember, the House of Representatives, it's not a lot of lawyers in there. I mean, there's some lawyers for sure, but like, I mean, there are quite a few lawyers in there, but let's just, to be fair, House of Representatives tends to be people who aren't famous yet going into politics, and tends to be people who don't have the magic, but the community likes them. That's your House of Representatives. They're not super great at creating great law. They're super great at creating law that people would love to vote on, but it's usually poorly written and doesn't consider all of the consequences that'll happen. The IEEPA's regulate cannot encompass tariffs, as dedicated trade statutes, in other words, Trade Expansion Act of 1962, use explicit terms like imposed duties, and reading it broadly would overlap unnecessarily with those laws. So in other words, they have another law that basically speaks more directly to tariffs. And they're saying, hey, Trump is trying to use this law as an emergency to be able to negotiate all these trade agreements. But there's another law that's more on point specifically for tariffs, and they should be using that law. That is called the whole code rule doctrine. Now, these doctrines get debated by judges, justices, all that stuff. Where are the different justices? Remember, justices are high-level judges. Where are the different justices at specifically with each one of these laws? Okay, so you got Chief Justice Roberts, John Roberts. He's the top one. He's the big show, right? He's the top. You know, he's the heavy of the group. So bottom line is this, Roberts tends to be very skeptical of the IEEPA's regulate importation wording, and whether or not it fully speaks to whether or not that can be used for tariffs. He did invoke the major question doctrine strongly, basically as to whether or not Trump has the authority or whether Congress should have the authority to go ahead and put tariffs on other nations. He is saying congressional authorization should likely be required for this situation from the questions that he's been asking. He did point out that the IEEPA does not mention tariffs. It does not mention duties. It does not mention taxes. So at the end of the day, it feels like this rule that Trump is using to claim that he can do whatever he wants with creating tariffs, at the end of the day, it feels like Congress should be in charge of that. And currently, Congress did not give the president of the United States the ability to do whatever he wants with tariffs, even though they sort of limited it with Nixon in the 1970s. But other than that, it's the classic thing. It's when the Democrats are in, Republicans sue. When the Republicans are in, the Democrats sue. Although I do see a lot more suits with the Democrats. The Democrats are right now trying to sink the nation by destroying Trump's tariffs. Kind of like what they were doing with the whole, we have to, get all these, payments together for the government to back people who can't afford their health insurance. I don't know if you guys realize that whole situation, but like the whole Obama era program for health insurance failed. It failed because the government had to keep voting in subsidies to help pay for poor people to be able to afford their own health insurance. So if you have to have subsidies to pay for the health insurance, the new program that Obama put in, because the old one was getting too expensive, instead of the government during the Obama era just saying, hey, we're going to push harder on insurance companies and make their prices go down, instead of doing that, they took over the insurance industry. And it has failed ever since because the whole reason they needed to take it over was to have poor people to be able to afford their health insurance, which it never achieved that. In fact, it's getting worse. It's getting out of control at this point. Some of the subsidies that they had in the bill couldn't even pay for what they would need to with the increased costs that these, lower income people would need to pay for their health insurance. It's a failed system. It failed. And the weird thing is they were saying we have to have the money for this or else we won't allow the government to reopen. And of course, the Republicans did their shit too. They closed down the House for the most part when it comes to voting. They're waiting for the Senate to do this. And if they didn't do this, what the Republicans wanted to do, they really weren't moving forward on anything else. Both sides, shitty people. Both sides let people get in very bad situation. Okay. Justice Neil Gorsuch, very good Gorsuch, very good justice. Here we go. Very concerned about the non-delegation. Gorsuch upholding Trump's reading would create a one-way ratchet, quote. Once Congress gives this power, it might never meaningfully get it back. Because the president would then at that point be able to control and, basically handle all negotiated aspects of tariffs with other nations, just like a king would. He said, Justice Neil Gorsuch, that, or at least he questioned about it, on the separation of powers, he's asking, hey, what would stop Congress from completing this abdication of its trade powers with international groups? Should we allow the president to have that? He questioned how the IEEPA really should work when we have other laws that are more specific to tariffs. And yet Trump is making his whole argument on whether or not he can go ahead and negotiate tariffs based off of this rule that doesn't really go into tariffs. Justice Amy Barrett, grilled the Solicitor General about whether regulate importation has ever been interpreted to mean the power to impose tariffs. She cited the predecessor law, which is the TWEA, the Trading with the Enemy Act, and seemed skeptical about equating that wartime statute's limited use to the very broad peacetime tariffs Trump imposed. She raised practical concerns. If the court were to strike down the tariffs, she worried about logistical mess, how reimbursements would work, how to unwind the tariff structure. Because how do you send billions and ultimately potentially trillions back to other nations? And then, what happens then. America can't afford to be America without these tariffs at this point. Next one, Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He's more favorable to the administration than other skeptics when it comes to supporting Trump. I think he has a general overview understanding that if they don't fix the tariffs with these other countries and get them in line to use the U.S. reserve currency, that we're all shit out of luck. The idea is he's saying at what point would the president's ability to modify tariffs be acceptable? What about a 1% tariff increase? What about a 1% tariff decrease? What happens? What should the president be able to do? He said, basically there's an issue with regulated importation, should be read, and how that squares with the IEPA's text and structure is an issue. But what it's coming down to is if we expect the leader of the free world to communicate with other leaders of other countries about trade, the problem is we can't really rely on Congress to come together to deliver a plan because they've bankrupted the country up to this point. That's the reality. Justice Samuel Alito hasn't really been very vocal about this situation. We don't know exactly what's going on with the ideology behind Justice Alito, so we don't really know yet. Justice Clarence Thomas, he raised the major question doctrine concern. Thomas joined in questioning whether the IEEPA's silence on tariffs, duties, means a missing clear grant of power. He pushed back a bit on the idea that, that there is a national emergency, a foreign affairs domain, that the court should defer to the president doing what they want to do, the White House doing what it wants to do during an emergency. The idea is that I think this particular judge, justice, was a little bit more realistic with the situation in that Trump, through some power, has to be able to negotiate with other countries. Every president does. So I think this particular justice is sitting back and saying, what power should the president be able to have? And how much negotiation should the president be able to do without congressional approval? Now we get to more of the more left-leaning justices. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, very critical of the administration's framing. She said, quote, "You want to say tariffs are not taxes, but they are." She emphasized Congress's core constitutional power to tax. She also made a major questions point. These tariffs have, quote, "vast economic and political significance." So basically, she's saying that this should all be handled by Congress. If Congress were to handle tariffs, of course, America would collapse. So, there needs to be a middle point with this situation. Justice Elena Kagan, very skeptical on the idea that the tariffs, which raise revenue, can be shoehorned into regulatory statute. She's also aware that Trump is basically pushing the agenda to get the American people on his side. If they get a $2,000 stimulus, people, for Justice Kagan, are going to go ahead and basically support, the justices allowing him to have the power to pay the people $2,000 in a tariff stimulus. So bottom line is, sorry, my brain's a little because I'm sick right now. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, she is saying these tariff powers should exist with Congress, that they are inherent powers of Congress, but foreign affairs tends to be, when it comes to negotiation of things, an inherent power of the White House, the executive division. So there's this arguing between what taxing power should actually exist for these different groups. Okay. Next one. Justice, the new one, Jackson. Okay, very pointed. She said that Congress intended the IEEPA to limit presidential authority, not to expand it. She's correct. Pointing to its legislative history, she raised non-delegation style concerns, effectively arguing that given this much tariff power to the president undermines Congress's Article I powers. She also questioned how the political statutory checks, like reporting to Congress what's going on with the White House and tariffs, will practically guard against abuse, especially if the president can keep declaring emergencies. What she's saying is, if the president can go ahead and manipulate the tariff situation by declaring an emergency, then the president will just keep declaring an emergency to have this power. My stance. Okay, not a justice. America's most viewed, subscribe to, clicked on Social Security Disability Attorney. If you need a disability attorney, you can always give me a call, 9 to 5 kind of gig. My stance, and please remember to like and subscribe. A lot of you guys don't hit that like button. Please remember to like and subscribe. My stance on this situation, it would be the destruction of the economic pleasure of the American people if we did not aggressively negotiate tariffs with other countries. We cannot rely on Congress to do this. We can't. That's how we got the government shut down for the longest shutdown in the history of America. We just came out of it. Trump is an aggressive, asshole-ish type of person who's your classic 1980s CEO. Classic. He lives for making deals. He loves it. Less than 0.00001% of society like to live that way. Most people like to be happy. Most people like to go into nature, go to a movie, stuff like that. Most people don't want to sit there in that anxiety buzz thinking about whether or not the deal is going to go through. So most Americans don't understand the weird psychological, psychotic level of person it takes to have somebody who's into constantly making deals. They're rare. They're weird. He's one of those types. Okay? Biden's not one of those types. Okay? I don't think, to be honest with you, JD Vance is one of those types. I think JD Vance is more of a on his high horse type of individual. Yes, I know I look like him. I know. I always get that. The point is, by the way, I was a bit more known than him, viewed than him on YouTube, and then Trump chose him. And now I have to say I look like him instead of he looks like me because he's the vice president now. But it is what it is. The point is, just to be fair with all this, at the end of the day, the problem we have is that we have to have better trade and protect our reserve currency so that we can afford all of our military bases across the entire earth. If we don't have our military superiority, our supreme military stance, we will not have our currency be used by other countries. And if our currency isn't being used by other countries, everything you buy gets real expensive real fast. Way faster than Bidenomics. Although Bidenomics literally created this exact problem to some degree. So my point to you is, at the end of the day, and I think this is incredibly important, do you support the American people allowing Trump, allowing the Constitution to be maybe amended to give the president power to tax other nations? Do you not give him that power? Do you make it so that Congress has to have that power? Or do you do a hybrid in between? The president has certain power. He has certain guardrails and guidelines that he has to follow. He has to report to Congress every week, every whatever, when it comes to negotiation agreements being done. Where is the medium ground? I think what ultimately has to, in practical application, occur is that the president has to have the capacity to handle tariffs, but he has to report that to Congress. And Congress has to be made up-to-date, informed, progress reports. They have to have these so that they, if they see something they don't like, can pass a bill into law that restricts what's going on with a particular nation or what the president is doing in general. Now remember, ... Just remember, ... Thank you, Susan Smith. I like JD Vance, but you are way cuter. I super appreciate it. So just remember with this whole situation that when it comes to the future of America, Americans have to have cheaper food, cheaper insurance, cheaper home insurance, health insurance, car insurance, cheaper basically homes to purchase. We have a problem in America. And the funny thing is this, the biggest problem isn't this. Taxing other nations, tariffs, that ain't even on like the top 5. It's not even on the top 5 problems. The number one problem in the United States, the number one issue above all in the United States is that Americans aren't having kids anymore. The ones that go and get jobs and create kids that go and get jobs, yada, yada. They're not making kids anymore. You have women that have mostly heavily moved to the left. A lot of woke ideology. You have men that mostly have moved to the right. And we're talking about millennials and younger. When it comes to going back to more of the classic, Christian family structure, they're not having kids anymore. They're not. And that is a big problem because you have a large population of young males that are frustrated and angry and pissed off, and they don't have a woman's touch. And as a result of that, nothing's really there to curve the masculinity of let's go to war. I believe raw. There's no woman's touch on that right now. Not making enough children that go and work is a very big problem. Some of you say artificial intelligence robots will take care of that. Maybe you're right. But remember, if America doesn't keep producing a lot of kids, its economy does fail. And also remember, we do need soldiers to go into war. And also remember, we do need humans on planet Earth, inside the borders of America, to have an America. That is our biggest problem right now. That's our big saucy issue. With that said, and of course, remember, who's going to pay for retirement if there's no new people working? I will catch you all a little bit later. I'm about to lose my voice again. Attorney Walter Hnot, please remember to be kind to each other. Please remember to like and subscribe. If you have Medicare questions, I don't do Medicare stuff. give Chapter a call, 339-226-6287, 339-226-6287. If you need a tune-up on your Medicare, you want to learn about what's going on specifically with Medicare and all the fraud and abuse, the doctors that they're arresting, the back office personnel that they're arresting, they're following it, give them a call. Attorney Walter Hnot, like and subscribe. Head over to Google, type in Disability Resolution Law Firm. Again, Disability Resolution Law Firm. Throw some stars up there if you like. And remember, I go live on Mondays and Thursdays to answer questions for free about disability law, America's most viewed and subscribed to Disability Attorney. I will catch you all a little bit later and have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you so much. I'll catch you later. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.